Have you ever felt like the love you've given, the story you've built, was treated as something embarrassing? I was there, in Seville, and I saw firsthand the moment a lifetime's legacy was turned into a shameful secret because of a single request. What happened to Doña Mila showed me something no one ever warns you about. Sometimes, the words that hurt us the most come from those we love the most. Imagine living a whole life shaped by music, rhythm, and passion, only to suddenly have that very history asked to be erased in the blink of an eye. That's the reality for Doña Mila, a grandmother who, with every cent saved, built not just a gift, but a legacy for her granddaughter. Today, I'm going to show you how one innocent phrase transformed an act of love into an act of pain, and how it impacted this family's life forever. Stay with me, because you'll discover how to prevent your own story from being silenced. Every second counts, because if you ignore this lesson, you risk failing to value what's most important in your life. Stay with me until the end, and discover the one gesture that saved Doña Mila from a broken heart before it was too late. You won't believe what happened when her granddaughter finally discovered the truth. I'm Doña Emilia Castillo, though most people in my neighborhood just call me Mila. I'm 78 years old, and I've lived in the same small house in Seville since I married Ernesto in 1969. He was a flamenco guitarist, one of those rare souls who could make the strings speak more clearly than words ever could. He died 10 years ago, and I still set his old chair by the window each morning, like he might walk in and sit down with his coffee. My days are quiet now, filled with jasmine and memories, and punctuated by video calls from my granddaughter, Clara. Clara is everything to me. She's 22, sharp as a blade, and has the kind of eyes that make you feel like you've been understood completely. When she got into that fancy master's program in Paris, I cried like a fool and then lit a candle for her at San Salvador. I've been saving for years to give her something special, something that speaks of where she comes from. I found an antique Spanish guitar, a replica of the one my abuelo used to play when I was a girl. I paid for it in tiny pieces, hiding the receipts in a red folder behind my books. It was meant to be a gift of pride, of legacy. It was meant to say, I see you, but don't forget where you began. That morning, I had just come back from the market, carrying tomatoes that still smelled like the sun. I was in my kitchen, unwrapping a fresh loaf of bread, when Clara's face lit up my phone screen. She was glowing, telling me about some big academic thing, a presentation in front of international scholars. I clapped, laughed, and promised to light another candle. But then, somewhere in the middle of all that joy, her tone shifted. She said, Abuela, when we're at the dinner this weekend, could you maybe not bring up your old guitar stories? I froze, holding a slice of bread in midair. What do you mean, cariño? I asked, trying to keep the smile in my voice. She hesitated. It's just, people don't really get it. I want them to see me as a serious academic, not just the granddaughter of a flamenco player. My heart squeezed in that slow, quiet way it does when something breaks but doesn't shatter. I nodded. I told her it was fine. Claro, mi amor. Whatever you need. After we hung up, I just sat there, at the table. The bread had gone stale. The jasmine outside had started to wilt. I thought about all the years I'd told Clara stories of Ernesto, how he played under the orange trees for coins and kisses, how music saved us during the hardest winters. And now somehow that love was a footnote she didn't want read aloud. I stood up slowly, my knees crackling like old wood, and walked to the little desk in my bedroom. The red folder was still where I left it. I pulled out the receipt, the final. Payment was due that week. I traced the curves of the guitar's name with my finger. I didn't cry. Not then. I just felt very still. I dialed the number of the antique shop, the same man who had met me 3 times with warm coffee and stories about the guitar's original luthier. When he picked up, I told him I wouldn't be completing the purchase. He paused, surprised. I thanked him anyway. Then I hung up. I sat there for a long time, just listening to the tick of the old clock Ernesto had fixed, once with a paperclip and a prayer. And then the phone rang again. Clara's voice, bright and unbothered, filled the room. She talked about her outfit, the venue, how nervous and thrilled she was. I answered all her questions, told her she'd do wonderfully. She didn't ask why I sounded tired, She didn't know I had just erased 2 years of saving in one quiet phone call. When I hung up, I looked at myself in the mirror. Lipstick still perfect, earrings still matched, but something in my eyes looked hollow. Not broken, not angry, just tired in a way that goes deep. I wiped under one eye, careful not to smudge the makeup, and that's when I knew. I wouldn't tell her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That afternoon, I watered the jasmine twice, though it didn't need it. I just didn't want to sit down. The courtyard was warm, the kind of golden light that makes everything look softer, almost forgiving. I sat on Ernesto's old bench and tried to imagine how he would have reacted. He would have laughed, shook his head, strummed a few sad notes, and said something like, "Children don't know the weight of what they leave behind." But I didn't feel like laughing. I felt like a hallway no one walks through anymore. At sunset, I lit a small candle near the photo of him, the one where he's wearing that ridiculous white suit with the pink carnation I made him wear at our wedding. "I tried," I whispered. "I really tried." The guitar was never just an instrument. It was our story, and in a way, I had hoped Clara would carry that story with her, even just a piece. But now, that dream sat in the past tense, tucked away with the receipts. That night I didn't sleep much. I folded and refolded the same handkerchief, the blue one Clara embroidered for me when she was 10. It still smelled faintly of lavender. Around 3 a.m., I sat in the kitchen with a glass of warm milk, staring at the shadow of the guitar case that no longer needed filling. My house, which always felt like a warm cocoon, suddenly seemed to echo. Maybe it was me. Maybe I was the echo. The next morning, I woke up early and went to the church. Not for mass, just to sit. The cool stone pews always made me feel grounded. I didn't pray for understanding. I prayed for softness. I didn't want to grow hard, not at this age. The priest, Father Anselmo, passed by and nodded gently. He didn't say a word, but he left a small bundle of rosemary on the altar. He must have seen something in my eyes. When I got home, Clara had sent a voice message. She was rehearsing her speech and wanted to test her timing. I listened, and she sounded brilliant, poised, articulate. But somewhere in there, she mentioned how she came from a simple background, a phrase that stuck to me like a cold draft. Simple, as if we were a watercolor version of something more worthy. I deleted the message without replying. Later that day, my neighbor Lucia came over with marmalade. She's younger than me by 20 years, but she treats me like her mother. She asked if I was okay, and I almost told her. But instead, I just smiled and said I'd caught a little cold. We drank coffee, and she chatted about the market, about her son's girlfriend, about nothing. It helped. Not enough to fix the ache, but enough to remember I wasn't invisible. By the time evening came, I sat down at the same desk again. I opened a blank page in my notebook and wrote Clara a letter, not to send, just to let the words leave my chest. I told her about the guitar, the savings, the hope. I told her about Ernesto's hands, how they bled the first year he played, how his music paid for our first refrigerator. I ended the letter with, "I love you even when it hurts." Then I folded the letter and placed it inside the red folder. Next to it, I left the last receipt, unsigned. I didn't know what I wanted to do yet, whether to forget it all or find another way. But I knew I couldn't carry this ache without letting it rest somewhere outside my body. Writing it down felt like an exhale after days of holding my breath. The following day, I went about my errands as usual, but everything felt slightly off, as if the colors of my neighborhood had faded a shade. The tomato vendor at the market asked me twice if I was feeling all right. I just smiled and said, "A little tired, nothing more." Inside, though, there was a dull ache, the kind that lingers just behind the ribs. That afternoon, I passed by the music shop where I had first found the guitar. I didn't go in. I stood across the street, watching a young boy pressing his face against the window, pointing at the same guitar I had chosen for Clara. Back home, I made lentil stew, even though I wasn't hungry. Cooking gave me something to do with my hands, something repetitive to drown out the echo of Clara's words. I thought of the night I first told her about Ernesto's guitar, the way her eyes lit up when I described his calloused fingers, and the way his foot would tap instinctively, like a heartbeat. She was just 9 years old then. She asked me if I thought music could remember things. I told her yes, that sometimes it remembers what people forget. That evening, I received a call from Clara's mother, my daughter-in-law Isabel. She was organizing the family dinner Clara had mentioned and wanted to make sure I was coming. I said I'd be there. Isabel didn't notice anything odd in my voice. I've learned over the years how to cover a crack with just enough polish. After we hung up, I pulled out the outfit I had planned for the dinner, a dark blue dress with embroidered cuffs and my mother's silver earrings. I added a scarf, red, silk, and defiant. When Saturday came, I took a cab to Isabel's house. The dinner was in full swing when I arrived. Laughter spilling from the windows, wine glasses clinking, the smell of roasted peppers and garlic wafting through the air. Clara was already there, animated and glowing, surrounded by her aunts and uncles. She ran to greet me, kissed my cheeks, told me how happy she was I could come. And for a moment, just a breath of one, I saw the little girl who used to fall asleep on my lap while Ernesto played. We sat at a long table in the garden, under strings of warm lights. Clara began her speech midway through the meal, thanking everyone for their support. She spoke of hard work, of ambition, of sacrifice. She didn't mention music. She didn't mention family roots. And though I smiled and clapped like everyone else, I felt as if I were slowly dissolving into the fabric of my chair. I was proud of her, truly, but I also felt like a ghost at a celebration I once had a hand in building. After dessert, one of Clara's uncles brought out a guitar, just a simple one, nothing like Ernesto's. He handed it to her, joking that she should play something to honor her Spanish side. Clara laughed nervously, shaking her head. "I don't really know how," she said. "Besides, that's more my abuela's thing." Everyone chuckled, including me, but inside, I felt something quiet and final fall away. It wasn't just the guitar she was distancing herself from. It was the entire language of where she came from. Later that night, as I waited for the cab to take me home, Clara came to sit beside me on the stone bench near the garden gate. "Did you enjoy the dinner, abuela?" she asked. I nodded. "It was lovely, mi niña. You spoke so well." She smiled, proud, and leaned her head on my shoulder like she used to. And for a few seconds, everything felt soft. Again, then she whispered, "Thank you for understanding about the guitar stories." I kissed her forehead and said nothing. But inside, the silence roared. The taxi ride back home was quiet. The driver, a man in his 40s with a soft accent from Cadiz, tried to start a conversation about the Sevilla match that night, but I barely responded. My thoughts were tangled up in Clara's voice, in the way she had thanked me for my silence, as if I had done something noble, as if giving up a piece of myself was some sort of gift. I stared out the window, watching the night blur into orange lamplight and hollow storefronts, and wondered if Ernesto would have stayed silent too, or if he would have spoken, played, sung, something. When I stepped into the house, the familiar scent of jasmine and old wood greeted me. I dropped my purse by the door and sat on the edge of my bed without taking off my shoes. The moonlight poured through the curtains, soft and indifferent. I reached for the red folder, again, pulled out the letter I had written to Clara, and reread every word. My handwriting trembled in places. I had poured so much into that letter, but I still didn't know if I had the right to let her read it. That night, I dreamed of Ernesto. He was sitting on the courtyard bench, strumming that guitar with his eyes closed, humming a tune I hadn't heard in years. In the dream, Clara was there too, a child again, clapping along with the rhythm, her curls bouncing with joy. When I woke up, my pillow was damp, and the sky outside was the gray blue of just before sunrise. I held on to the dream as long as I could, but it faded fast, like most beautiful things do. On Sunday morning, I made coffee the way Ernesto used to, strong and almost bitter. I sat by the window with my cup and watched the neighborhood wake up. An old couple passed by, holding hands. A boy on a scooter chased a pigeon into the plaza. Life moved, even when your heart stood still. I decided to do something different. I got dressed, tied a silk scarf around my neck, emerald green this time, and walked to the shop where I had first seen the antique guitar. The man at the shop, Carlos, recognized me instantly. "Señora Mila," he said with a warmth that caught me off guard. "I didn't think I'd see you again." I smiled faintly and told him I was just browsing. He didn't push. He simply nodded and let me wander. The guitar was still there, hanging on the wall like it had been waiting. I stood in front of it for a long time, just breathing, just remembering. My fingers itched to touch it, but I kept my hands clasped behind my back. Carlos eventually approached me again. "It's still available," he said gently. "No one else has asked for it." I looked at him, at the fine lines around his eyes, and I said, "I canceled the payments because someone I love asked me to forget where I come from." He didn't ask questions. He just placed a soft cloth on the counter and said, "Sometimes, remembering is more important than being understood." I thanked him and left, but his words stayed with me. Back at home, I opened my closet and pulled out an old box from the top shelf. Inside was Ernesto's original guitar, the one he stopped using when his fingers became too stiff. It still smelled of cedar and rosin. I tuned it slowly, my fingers rusty but steady. I sat in the courtyard and began to play, softly, clumsily, but with all the love I had left in me. A few neighbors stopped to listen from their balconies. One applauded quietly. I smiled for the first time in days. That evening, I recorded a voice message for Clara. Not a lecture, not a story, just me, playing. No words, just the sound of my fingers tracing memory. Then I sent it and left my phone on the table, face down. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. I didn't hear back from Clara that night, nor the next morning. But I wasn't anxious. There was something peaceful about having let it out, like opening a window in a house that had been closed too long. I spent the day cleaning the courtyard, trimming the jasmine, and brushing dust off the ceramic tiles Ernesto had painted by hand. It felt good to move, to make beauty again with my own 2 hands. Music and memory weren't the only things he left me. He also left me this home, my rhythm, my backbone. In the afternoon, while folding laundry, I caught myself humming an old Sevillana. It was one Ernesto used to play at family gatherings, the kind that made people clap without realizing. The memory came back so vividly I had to sit down. I could almost feel the weight of Clara in my lap as a child, asking me if the guitar could talk. I had told her yes, but now I realized it only talks when someone listens. That evening, I received a message from Clara. Just a single sentence. "That was beautiful, abuela." No emoji, no follow-up, but I could hear her voice in those words, softer than before, a little unsure. I didn't reply right away. I let it breathe. Let her sit with it the same way I had sat with her words a few days before. The silence between us was no longer sharp. It had become a space where something new might grow. The next morning, she called. Her voice was hesitant at first, but warm. "I didn't realize that song meant so much," she said. I told her it wasn't just a song. It was a part of who we were, of who she was, even if she didn't see it yet. There was a pause. "I think I've been trying so hard to fit in," she said quietly, "that I forgot what made me different might actually be a gift." I didn't cry. I smiled deeply. That was enough. She asked me to send her the name of the piece I played. She wanted to learn it. I could barely believe it. I told her I'd write down the chords and mail them, along with the story behind the melody. She laughed, saying, "You're the only person I know who still sends handwritten letters." I told her, "And you're the only one I'd still write them for." There was silence on the line, but the kind that holds something tender. That week, I started playing more often. Not for anyone, just for me. The music returned to my hands slowly, like a friend I hadn't seen in years. My neighbors began to notice. One day, a boy from down the street asked if I could teach him a song. He had eyes like Ernesto's, bright, curious, impatient. I said yes, and just like that, music began living in my courtyard again. One afternoon, Lucia dropped by with fresh figs and caught me mid-song. She sat, listened, wiping her eyes with her apron. "You sound like yourself again," she said. I hadn't realized how far I'd drifted. Sometimes pain disguises itself as silence. But music has a way of pulling you back to your name. That night, I wrote Clara another letter. This one was shorter. I told her that the guitar had never been just an instrument. It had been our inheritance. And that even though I canceled the gift, I realized I had already given it to her a long time ago. In the stories. In the nights on my lap. In every note Ernesto ever played that stayed in her bones. A few days later, a small package arrived from Paris. Wrapped in brown paper and sealed with careful tape, it had Clara's handwriting on it. Loopy, rushed, familiar. Inside was a small notebook, covered in deep green linen. On the first page, she had written, "For the stories you didn't tell, for the music I'm still learning to hear." I held the book against my chest for a long moment, overwhelmed by the weight of something so light. Each page was blank, intentionally, a quiet invitation, a space for me to fill. That evening, I took a pen and wrote down the story of the first time Ernesto played for me under the stars. I described the way his fingers moved like they were following a memory older than either of us. I wrote about the neighbors who leaned out of their windows to listen, and how I knew that night I would marry him, even if we had nothing. I kept writing. Every day, a new page. Some were stories Clara had heard before. Others were fragments I had never shared. The time Ernesto pawned his watch to buy Clara her first baby shoes. The night we couldn't afford heat, so he played guitar until we forgot we were cold. Writing it all down felt like tuning an instrument I hadn't touched in years. My memory, once foggy, began to sharpen. One afternoon, I mailed the notebook back to Clara, halfway filled. I added a note. Now it's your turn. I wanted her to understand that legacy wasn't something you receive all at once. It's something you build piece by piece, like a melody learned slowly over time. She replied 2 days later with a voice message. She was crying. I didn't deserve this, she said, but I'm so grateful you gave it anyway. From that moment on, our conversations changed. Less about accomplishments, more about roots. She began asking questions about Ernesto, about my childhood, about the smell of orange blossoms in April, and the old flamenco bars that used to echo through the alleyways. I told her everything, and she listened, not out of obligation, but with hunger, like she was finally tuning in to a station that had always been playing. One morning, she sent me a photo. She was holding a secondhand Spanish guitar, grinning, her hair messy, her fingers clumsy on the frets. I'm terrible, she wrote, but I'm trying. I laughed, genuinely, not because she was bad, but because I knew that trying was where everything begins. Ernesto used to say, the soul lives in the attempt. That night, I played again in the courtyard. It had rained earlier, and the stones were still damp, glistening under the lantern light. As I played, a soft breeze carried the scent of wet jasmine, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not closure, not resolution, but a quiet sense of restoration. I wasn't trying to bring back the past anymore. I was simply letting it breathe through me. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen, not as someone's grandmother, not as a widow, but as a woman with music in her bones and stories in her blood. And that, I realized, was enough. The days settled into a new rhythm. In the mornings, I played guitar while the light poured into the courtyard. At noon, I walked to the market, where even the olive vendor began asking about my music. In the afternoons, I wrote, not only for Clara, but for myself, for the young woman I had been, for the wife I had once been, and for the grandmother I was still learning to become. Writing helped me remember that life had always spoken to me in verses, even when I had forgotten how to listen. Clara continued to send small messages, photos of her guitar progress, a clip of her playing a simple scale, a short video of her practicing a sevillana with the wrong rhythm but the right spirit. I didn't correct her. I only encouraged. Because I knew the music wasn't about precision. It was about remembering that you come from somewhere, and that where you come from matters. One day, I received a letter, not from Clara, but from the antique shop. Carlos had written to tell me that the guitar I once wanted was being discontinued, only one left, and no more would be made. He wasn't pressuring me, just letting me know in case I changed my mind. I sat with that letter for hours. I read it over and over again, and then I made myself a cup of tea, tied on my scarf, and walked out the door. When I arrived at the shop, Carlos greeted me with that same respectful nod. He brought out the guitar and placed it in my hands. I didn't strum, I just held it. It felt heavier than I remembered, but right, like something that had waited too long to find its place. I looked up at Carlos and said, I'd like to finish paying for it. His eyes softened. Of course, he said. Take all the time you need. I paid in full that same day. As I walked home with the case in hand, people stopped me on the street, some out of curiosity, others in recognition. A few older women even smiled and said, Doña Mila, qué alegría verla con su guitarra. And I smiled back, not because of the instrument, but because I knew what it meant. It wasn't just a gift anymore. It was a bridge between who I had been, who I was, and who Clara might still become. When I got home, I placed the guitar on the small table in the center of the living room. I didn't wrap it. I didn't hide it. It belonged there, visible, unapologetic. That night, I sat beside it with a glass of sherry and watched the evening. Light stretch across the walls like fingers brushing against old secrets. The house felt fuller somehow. Later, I recorded another message for Clara. "There's something here for you," I said. "It'll wait until you're ready. No rush. Music doesn't expire." A few days later, Clara called me again, this time from a park in Paris. Her face flushed with cold, her scarf pulled tight around her neck. "Abuela," she said, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about music not expiring." She hesitated. "I think I want to come home for a few days during the holiday break, just to reconnect a bit." My heart didn't leap, but it settled, like a puzzle piece falling quietly into place. I told her I'd be here, that I always would be. When she arrived, it was a gray Thursday morning in December. I met her at the train station, and for a brief second, she looked like the little girl I used to pick up from school. Tired eyes, messy bun, hands full of books and questions. She hugged me longer than usual, and when we stepped into the house, the first thing she did was walk over to the guitar. She didn't touch it. She just stared at it, her expression unreadable. "Is that the one?" she asked. I nodded. "It's been waiting." The first 2 days, we didn't speak much about it. We cooked, we laughed, we walked through the Plaza de España and fed the pigeons like we used to. She told me about her classes, her roommates, the overwhelming feeling of being surrounded by brilliance. "Everyone is smarter than me," she said once over coffee. I told her they might be loud, but that doesn't always mean wise. She smiled, quiet but grateful. On the third night, as we sat by the fire with a thick blanket draped over our knees, Clara picked up the guitar. She held it awkwardly, trying to remember the chords I had sent her. Her fingers fumbled, but the sound was unmistakable. That first imperfect chord filled the room like the scent of something baking, familiar, warm, full of memory. She laughed at herself. "I'm terrible." I shook my head. "You're brave." We played together. Well, I played, and she tried. The courtyard, now cold and still, seemed to lean closer to listen. For the first time, she asked about Ernesto's playing. I told her things I hadn't told anyone, like how he used to hum when he was nervous, how he never played the same song the same way twice, how he taught me to listen more with my heart than my ears. She didn't interrupt. She just absorbed it all like rain, into dry earth. That night, before going to bed, Clara stood in the doorway of my room. "Abuela," she said softly, "I think I was ashamed. Not of you, of being different, of not fitting into the world I thought I wanted." I didn't move. I just let her speak. But now I realize what I tried to hide is exactly what makes me worth listening to. I opened my arms and she came in, and we held each other for a long time. The silence between us now felt like music. The next morning, Clara asked if she could take the guitar back with her to Paris. Not to keep forever, but just for a while. I want to learn, properly, not because I have to, but because I finally want to understand. I said yes. No ceremony, no speech, just yes. She wrapped it in a blanket and carried it out like something sacred, and it was. As she boarded her train that afternoon, I watched her from the platform. She looked back one last time, lifted the guitar case slightly with a smile, and mouthed, "Gracias." I didn't cry. I felt whole. The house felt quieter after Clara left, but not in a hollow way. It was a peaceful kind of quiet, like after a good concert when the final note lingers in the air. I moved through the rooms with a different rhythm. I no longer avoided the red folder. I no longer tiptoed around memories. I embraced them. Each time I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, I imagined Clara doing the same with the guitar in her lap. Across the miles, we were finally in tune. A few weeks later, I received a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a handwritten letter from Clara. Her handwriting was slightly neater this time, more intentional. She wrote about her lessons, about how her fingers hurt in places she didn't know had muscles. She wrote about how she'd played one of Ernesto's old melodies for a small group at university, and how afterward, one of her classmates came up and said, That didn't sound academic, but it sounded like home. Clara ended the letter with, "I think I'm starting to get it." I folded that letter 3 times and tucked it into the notebook I'd started months before. That night, I sat down and wrote a reply, this time not as a grandmother or a teacher, but as a fellow traveler in the language of memory. I told her how proud I was, but more importantly, how moved I was that she was learning to love her own story. I included another melody, handwritten in the margins, and a small pressed flower from our courtyard, one of the first jasmine blooms of the season. By early spring, Clara sent a video message. She was sitting on the edge of her bed in Paris, the guitar resting on her thigh, and though her posture was still awkward, her fingers moved with a little more confidence. She played slowly, her brows furrowed in concentration, and then she stopped halfway and looked at the camera. "I still mess up every 3rd chord," she said, laughing, "but I keep playing because it feels like I'm talking to you." That video became a small ritual. Every Sunday, she'd send a short clip, sometimes playing, sometimes just talking. And every Sunday, I responded with a story, a memory, or another song to learn. We were creating a new kind of conversation, one that didn't rely on perfect words, just honest sound. It was healing in a way I hadn't expected, like we were stitching a thread between generations, one note at a time. One day, while organizing the bookshelf, I found an old photo of me and Ernesto dancing at a feria, both of us flushed with wine and laughter. I stared at it for a long time. I realized something. Legacy isn't a relic. It's a rhythm. It's passed down through hands and stories and stumbles. I placed the photo on the mantel and lit a candle beside it, not out of mourning, but gratitude. That evening, I went out into the courtyard and played again. This time, I wasn't alone. A few neighbors had started showing up on Sundays just to listen. Some brought chairs, others leaned against the walls. I didn't make announcements. I just played. And somehow, the music always found its audience. The songs were old, but they breathed new each time they left my fingers. And one Sunday, just as I finished a familiar melody, I looked up, and there was Clara, standing at the gate, smiling. I hadn't known she was coming. She stepped inside, sat beside me, and whispered, "Play it again?" And so I did. She stayed for a week. This time, it wasn't because she needed a break from the world. It was because she wanted to be here. With us. We cooked together, like we used to. I taught her how to make lentil stew from scratch without looking at the recipe card, and she taught me how to send voice notes on WhatsApp without cutting myself off mid-sentence. We laughed a lot, more than we had in years. There was music, but there was also silence, and none of it felt awkward. Each night, we sat in the courtyard after dinner with the guitar between us. Some evenings I played while she listened. Other nights she tried to follow along, her fingers slow but deliberate. The neighbors still came. A few even brought their children. One of them, Lucia's grandson, started clapping softly in rhythm. Clara turned to me once and said, "This is what I always wanted. I just didn't know how to ask for it." On her last night, we didn't play. Instead, we sat by the window with the lights off, watching the stars blink over Seville. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I used to think being taken seriously meant leaving everything behind, but now I think maybe being taken seriously means knowing what to carry forward." I didn't reply. I just squeezed her hand. Before she left, she packed the guitar again, this time with care, reverence, and a sense of responsibility. "I'll take good care of it," she said. I believed her, not because she said it, but because I saw it in the way she looked at it now, as if it had become something more than wood and strings. It had become a story she didn't want to forget. She kissed me goodbye at the train station, then turned back one last time and said, "Next time, bring yours. We'll play together in Paris." I smiled. "Only if you cook." We both laughed, and I watched her disappear into the flow of passengers like a leaf carried downstream. But I didn't feel the usual ache of distance. I felt full. Back home, I stood in the middle of the living room and looked around. It felt alive again, not because Clara had been there, but because the silence she left behind was no longer heavy. It was expectant. It carried the echo of voices, of clumsy chords and spontaneous laughter. I opened the windows, letting the spring air in, and for the first time in years, I danced. Just a few steps, barefoot, across the tiles, but I danced. Later that evening, I wrote in the notebook again. I added a new page. The moment you stop hiding who you are, you make room for others to find themselves in you. It wasn't a lesson I had planned to teach Clara. It was one she had helped me relearn. I placed the notebook beside my bed and turned off the light, smiling into the dark. That night, I dreamed of my mother, my abuelo, Ernesto, all of them sitting in the courtyard, clapping to the rhythm of a song only I could hear. And this time, Clara was there too, playing, laughing, not as a stranger to the music, but as part of the chorus. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking less about what had been lost and more about what had been recovered. My days resumed their quiet rhythm, but now there was a thread of melody running through them. Even sweeping the tiles or stirring soup felt like part of a song. I started wearing Ernesto's old scarf when I played, not out of mourning, but as a way of saying, "We're still here." Clara kept her promise. Every Sunday, a new video arrived. Sometimes she was in her tiny Paris apartment, other times in a park or on a rooftop, always with that same guitar on her lap. The sound was getting better. Her fingers were less hesitant. But more than that, her eyes had changed. They no longer searched for approval. They carried something steadier now. Presence, maybe. Or pride. One morning, she sent me a message that made me pause. "I've been invited to perform a short piece at a cultural event at the university," she said. "They want something that represents heritage." I was thinking, maybe I could play one of Ernesto's songs. I didn't answer right away. I read the message 3 times, then simply typed, "He would be honored." That performance became a turning point. Clara sent me a video of it days later. She stood in front of a modest crowd, introduced the song in Spanish, and began to play. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. The tremble in her voice only added to the honesty. And when she finished, there was silence at first, then applause. Slow, heartfelt, real. She called me crying afterward. "I didn't know music could feel like this," she said. I told her it wasn't just music. "You opened a door," I said, "and on the other side you found all of us waiting." That silence again, full of something bigger than both of us. "Thank you," she whispered. But I had nothing left to say. Gratitude doesn't always need words. That night, I brought out my own guitar again. Not the antique one, the old one, Ernesto's. The one with the crack near the bass, and the pickguard worn down by years of love. I played slowly, letting my fingers drift where they wanted. A neighbor passed by and waved back, mid-note, and kept playing. There was no performance, no audience, just a woman and her ghosts, playing in harmony. In the following days, I began gathering all my music sheets, my notebooks, my stories. I wasn't planning anything formal, but I thought, maybe someday Clara will want more, and if I'm not here to tell them, they should still be told. I labeled everything by hand, tied it with ribbon, and placed it in a wooden box. I etched one word on the lid: races, roots. Tell her about the box. Not yet. Some things should be discovered, not given, like songs, like forgiveness. Summer arrived earlier than usual that year. The air in Seville became thick with the scent of azahar and sun-warmed stone. I began leaving my windows open all day, letting the music and voices of the street mix with the silence of my rooms. The courtyard was in full bloom, the jasmine climbing higher than I'd seen in years. It made me think of Clara, how sometimes growth happens quietly, even when no one is watching. One evening, I received a call I didn't expect. Clara's professor wanted to speak with me. In careful, accented Spanish, he explained that Clara had written a personal essay about our family's musical legacy, and he wanted to include part of it in a university journal. "It's more than music," he said. "It's about identity, heritage, resilience." I was stunned. Not proud, not flattered, just still, like hearing your own name spoken after a long silence. When I asked, Clara why she hadn't told me, she laughed and said, "I wanted it to be a surprise, but also, I wanted to make sure I got it right." I could hear the fear and love in her voice, woven together, inseparable, and in that moment, I knew. The legacy I once feared had been erased was not only alive, but evolving, not in my image or Ernesto's, but in Clara's, imperfect, brave, and completely her own. That weekend, I held a small gathering in the courtyard. Nothing formal, just a few close friends, neighbors, and their children. We cooked, we danced, we played. Lucia brought flan, and someone brought a cajon. At some point, without thinking, I began to play one of Ernesto's favorite songs. Halfway through, a boy of about 10 sat beside me and asked if he could try. I handed him the guitar without hesitation. He strummed a few uneven chords, then looked up at me. "It's hard," he said. I smiled. All good things are. And just like that, the music passed on again. Not perfectly, but truly, not cleanly. That's how legacies work. They live in the mess, in the attempt, in the sound of a child hitting the wrong note and trying again. That night, I received another letter from Clara. Inside was a photo, her performing again, this time at a local cafe in Paris, with a small crowd watching. The caption said, "I told them this was your melody." I stared at the image for a long time, not because of the moment captured, but because of the quiet behind her eyes. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She was just being. In the letter, she added a single line, "I'm not ashamed anymore." I folded the letter gently, kissed it, and placed it next to the others in the wooden box. Then I stood up, walked into the courtyard, and began to play. Not for anyone else, not even for Ernesto, just for me and the stars. That night, as I closed the shutters and turned off the lights, I paused at the guitar stand near the window. I rested my hand on the neck of the instrument and whispered, "You're not an embarrassment. You're a beginning." The next morning, I walked to the post office with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a copy of my old handwritten recipes, a faded photo of Ernesto tuning his guitar, and a letter addressed to Clara. I didn't write anything dramatic, just a few pages about the things that matter: music, memory, roots. I told her I was proud, not because she played well, but because she had learned to listen with her heart. That was always the hardest part. After dropping the package off, I stopped by the market. The tomato vendor waved and asked if I'd be performing on Sunday again. I told him maybe. Lucia was there too, picking peaches, and she hugged me with that look in her eyes, the one people give you when they sense something inside you has healed. I didn't say much. Some wounds are too old to name, but not too old to mend. At home, I made myself a simple lunch, tortilla and olives, and sat at the table in the sun. I glanced at the guitar in the corner and smiled. It no longer felt like a symbol of something denied. It was simply a companion again, something that had waited with patience for the right time to return to my hands. And it had. That evening, Clara called from a noisy cafe. "I only have a minute," she said, breathless. "But I just wanted to tell you. They invited me to give a talk next semester on cultural memory. They said my story moved them." She paused, then added, "Your story moved them." I told her to speak her truth, whatever shape it took, and to never forget that truth is louder when it's played, not shouted. That weekend, she performed one of Ernesto's songs for a group of visiting students from Spain. A girl approached her afterward and said, "That reminded me of my abuelo." When Clara told me later, I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. Ernesto had always said the best music wasn't the one that impressed. It was the one that reminded people of who they are. I didn't need to visit his grave anymore. I carried him in the chords, in the laughter of my granddaughter, in the pages of a notebook now filled with stories once too tender to share. I knew that if he could see us now, he wouldn't say anything. He'd just start playing. A few days later, Clara surprised me again. She was coming home for a long weekend, not because she was tired or unsure, but because she missed the sound of our courtyard. "I want to record us playing together," she said. "Just once. For me." I agreed without hesitation. Not because I had waited for it, but because I no longer needed to. When she arrived, we played in the courtyard like we had done that spring. Only this time, she led. I followed. Her rhythm wasn't perfect, but her presence was, and that made all the difference. After we finished playing, Clara set her phone on the table and pressed record again. But this time, she didn't play. She looked at me and said, "Can you tell me again how you and Abuelo met?" I laughed. "Haven't I told you that story 100 times? She grinned. "Yes, but I want to keep it, with your voice." And so, I began. Not rushed, not rehearsed, just as it happened. A dance, a song, a scarf in the wind, and a boy who played like he didn't know anything else. As I spoke, I realized something unexpected. My voice didn't tremble. My memory didn't falter. Telling that story wasn't about holding on anymore. It was about passing it forward. Clara listened with wide eyes, just like she had when she was little, but now she was recording not only the words, but the pauses, the laughter, the music behind my voice. We were building an archive of love. Later that night, we sat with the lights off, just like before, but this time, Clara held my hand. She said, "I know it hurt when I said those things. About the guitar, about the stories." I didn't say anything. She went on, "I thought I had to be someone else to matter, but now I know. I was never more myself than when I was sitting here with you, listening to you talk about him." My chest tightened, but in a sweet way. "It's okay," I said. "You came back." The next morning, we recorded one last video together. She played. I sang softly beside her, a slow, traditional piece, one Ernesto used to hum while cooking. When we finished, we looked at each other and laughed. No one else would understand the beauty of that moment, but we did. It felt like a full circle had closed, not with fanfare, but with quiet joy. That afternoon, before she returned to Paris, Clara placed the guitar gently back in its stand. "I'll leave it here," she said. "It belongs to this house, to this light." I nodded. "And when you need it again, it will be waiting." She kissed my cheek, picked up her bag, and walked out into the warmth of Seville, like someone who knew exactly where she came from. I didn't cry after she left. I made tea, opened the windows, and sat in the courtyard as the wind moved through the leaves like a soft melody. I didn't need to fill the silence. I had learned to live with it. I had learned that silence isn't absence. It's space. For memory, for music, for everything we're still becoming. That evening, I returned to the wooden box marked races. I added one more thing, a small flash drive with the recordings we made. I labeled it with Clara's handwriting, "Us." Then I closed the lid, placed the box back on the shelf, and smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest. And that was enough. Before going to bed, I stood by the window and looked out at the courtyard, glowing under the moonlight. I whispered, "Thank you, Ernesto." Not because I missed him, but because, in some way, he had never really left. A week later, I received a letter from Clara. This time, it wasn't just a note. It was a printed copy of her university article, the one her professor had mentioned. The title read, "Strings of Memory, How My Grandmother's Guitar Taught Me to Hear My Own Story." My hands trembled as I turned the pages, each word a thread that tied our worlds together. She had written about Ernesto, about our courtyard, about the moment she asked me not to speak of the guitar, and what followed after. Her honesty cut deep, but in the best way. She didn't make excuses. She acknowledged the hurt, the distance, the pride, and then she turned it into something beautiful, something alive. At the end, she wrote, "This is for her, for Doña Mila, who taught me that silence can carry songs too, if you're brave enough to listen." I placed the article in the wooden box with the rest, carefully, lovingly. That night, I pulled Ernesto's shawl over my shoulders and stepped out into the cool air. The city was quiet, save for a guitar playing faintly somewhere in the distance. I sat on the bench in the courtyard and let the music wash over me. I didn't need to know who was playing. I just smiled, knowing the world was full of echoes. I don't know how much time I have left, but I do know what I'll leave behind. Not just photographs or recipes or worn-out instruments. I'll leave behind a rhythm, a melody, a story that now lives in someone else's hands. Someone who once tried to silence the past and now carries it forward with grace. Sometimes, we think the greatest pain is being forgotten, but I've learned that the deeper wound is being remembered wrong. Clara, in her way, is remembering us right, and that, to me, is redemption. The guitar still rests in its place near the window. I don't play it every day, but when I do, I no longer feel like I'm playing alone. I feel the hands of time, of family, of legacy, all strumming alongside me, not correcting me, just joining in. And when people ask me now about Ernesto, or about my granddaughter, or about the stories behind the music, I no longer hesitate. I speak. I sing. I remember. Because what once felt like an ending was, in truth, just a pause in the song. And now, The melody continues. Sometimes until someone teaches us how to listen again. Maybe you, like Clara, once tried to leave something behind to be taken seriously. Or maybe, like me, you've carried your stories in your chest for years, unsure if anyone would ever want to hear them. Either way, I hope this story reminded you that our roots don't hold us back. They hold us steady. If you've ever felt ashamed of where you come from, or if you've ever made peace with a past that once hurt, I'd love to hear about it. Me cuenta, if you feel like it. Sometimes a single story can make someone else feel less alone. And if this reminded you of someone, your grandmother, a parent, or even a version of yourself, compártelo. Maybe it's time someone else heard it too. If you want to keep listening to stories like this one, stories that carry truth in soft chords and quiet voices, te invito a ficar por aquí. There's always another melody waiting to be remembered.